Greens.
Hello everyone. In this video we are going to learn the very basics of JavaScript. There's no prerequisite knowledge required other than maybe an ounce of HTML and an ounce or two of CSS. But anyways, let's get started by taking a look at a demo of the finished product that we will be building together. So here's my example page. We see this headline reads, "Click a list item to replace this text." And if I click on the first item, we see that updated the headline text and it selected the first item with a beige background. And we can click on any of the other items and the same thing happens. This next part of the video is for when you're adding new items to a list with this button. Whatever, let's get it. Another one, another one, another one, and another one. And as you might expect, we can then click on any of those dynamically generated items and they behave the same way. This example project may not seem very impressive, but it should give us the basic building blocks of front-end JavaScript, and then you can recycle those building blocks to create anything you want. Anyways, let's get started. Let's get hyped. So behind the scenes, I just deleted all of the JavaScript from the page. So now all I have is a bare bones, super basic HTML file with just a tiny bit of CSS applied to it. Which means at this point you can create a simple HTML file on your computer and follow along. Now before I even jump to my text editor, let's begin by writing a bit of JavaScript directly in our web browser. So to do that, we can just right-click anywhere on the page and click Inspect. That will open your developer tools, and then I want you to click on the Console tab. Now I'm using Google Chrome for my web browser, but Firefox and pretty much any other modern browser will have these same developer tool features. Anyways, from this console screen, we can begin typing or writing JavaScript. So for example, if I type 2 plus 2 and hit enter or return, JavaScript will do the math for us. Thank you, JavaScript, you're a genius. Or we could type 5 times 5 and hit enter. You get the idea. Now, nothing we write in the console here will be saved permanently. It just runs in the browser's memory and will be lost as soon as we refresh the page. So we tried 2 plus 2. Now let's try something a bit more interesting. So the web browser itself has a bunch of features and abilities, and we can access all of them with JavaScript. For example, the web browser has an object named window, and the window object basically contains everything that the web browser is capable of doing. So if you think of Russian stacking dolls, the window object is like the largest, outermost doll. Everything is contained within it. Now in this lesson, we're interested in another object that lives inside window that is named document. To access the document object, we could type window and then go within it with a period and then type document. But because window is the root object, it's basically assumed. It kind of goes without saying. So we don't need to actually type window, we can just type document. Now the document object contains all of the info about the current web page that we're viewing. It's a programmatic model of the page. So we can click on this to inspect it or analyze it. And here we see the HTML skeleton of the page. And manipulating this document object with JavaScript is how we make our pages come to life. So for example, notice the title of this web page. In the tab for this page, we see that the title is JavaScript. And we can double check that in my text editor. Here we see the title that I have specified. Now we can programmatically access that title with JavaScript by typing document.title. And we can even take things one step further and change the title. So we could say document.title equals testing 1, 2, 3. And now notice the title of the page. All right, now let's try something a bit more advanced. Let's try to do something with this H1 headline element. So let's begin by jumping into our HTML and giving that element a unique ID so that we can easily select it with JavaScript. So let's give it an ID of our headline. And now if we jump back to the console and refresh the page, we can select that headline element by starting with the document object and then looking inside it for a method named getElementById, and then open up a pair of parentheses, and then open up a pair of quotes, and within the quotes we just list the name of the ID that we're looking for. So our headline, and then press enter. So the console responds by echoing out that h1 element, but you'll notice that if I hover over it, in the background Chrome is highlighting the relevant element. Okay, so now that we know how to select an element with JavaScript, let's go one step further, and once an element is selected, let's do something with it. So let's select the element again, document getElementById, our headline, and then we can simply adjust that element's inner HTML property. So we can set it to equal, this is a test. And when I hit enter, we see that the headline is updated. Now let's imagine we want to change this headline text again. Now I don't know about you, but I'm sick of typing out document getElementById, our headline. That's a lot of typing and it's getting repetitive. So what we can do instead is create a variable that we can reuse. To create a variable, we just type var for variable, and then we come up with a variable name. We can name it anything we'd like. Let's call it our, and then uppercase H, headline. And let's say that this variable equals document, and then let's just select it. So getElementById, our headline. Okay, so now whenever we want to do anything to the headline element, instead of manually typing out the selector, we can just type out our variable name. So if we want to change this headline text once again, we can just say our headline and then adjust its inner HTML property. And let's say testing once again. And there we have it. So at this point, we have a general understanding of how JavaScript can manipulate the page. I think now is a good time to move out of the console and into our text editor, where we can actually create and save a JavaScript file. So within this example folder that I'm working in, I'll create a new folder. You don't need to do this, I'm doing it just to stay organized, but I'll name this new folder JS for JavaScript. And then within that new folder, I'll create a new file. You can name the file anything you'd like. I will name my file main.js. And then back in our HTML file, right before the closing body tag, let's say script. And let's give the opening script tag a source attribute and just point towards that new file. So in my case, go into the JS folder and grab main.js. All right, let's begin by writing code that will watch for any of these list items being clicked on. And when they are clicked on, we'll update this headline text to use the text from the item that got clicked on. So to do that, we'll need to begin by selecting all of the list items. So in our JavaScript file, why don't we create a variable that will save the selection of all of the list items? So var, and let's name the variable list items. Now we know how to select a single element by ID. We say document getElementById, but how do we select multiple elements? Well, instead of this method name, there's another one named getElements, plural, by class name. But then we'd need to go into our HTML and give each of these list items a class. And I think we can find a cleaner way of handling this. So instead, why don't we just give the parent unordered list item a unique ID. Let's go with an ID of our list. And then back in our JavaScript, we can begin by selecting the unordered list parent element. So getElementById, our list. And then we can chain on another method that will look within this element. And we can say getElementsByTagName and look for any li list item elements. Okay, so now we have a variable that is a collection of all of our list item elements. So this single variable contains all 5 of these elements. So in the console, we can type our variable name, list items, and we can see that it's an array-like object or a collection of elements. And we can access individual items in this collection by typing the variable name, so list items, and then open up a pair of square brackets. And if we want to access the first item in the collection, we enter a 0, because arrays are 0-based. So we say 0 instead of 1. So that returned the first item, and if we wanted to return the second item, we would just say 1. If we wanted the third item, we would say 2, so on and so forth. So the question now is, how can we do something to each item in our collection? So just as an example, let's say we want to change the text for all 5 items to simply be hello world. Well, we can't just type list items and then change its inner HTML property. So we see that that didn't do anything, and that's because our list items variable isn't pointing towards an element. Instead, it's a collection of references to 5 different elements. So instead, we would need to access each item in the collection individually. So we would need to say list items and select the first item in the collection, and then adjust its inner HTML. So we see that that did work, and then we would need to do the same thing for the second item, so change that to a 1. You get the idea. But we need to ask ourselves, do we really want to do that 5 times? And the answer is no, we don't want to do that. It's too much typing and it's really repetitive. Instead, we can have JavaScript loop through our collection automatically and do something for each item in the collection. So to set that up, we can use something called a for loop. So let's jump back to our text editor, and in our JavaScript file, let's write our first for loop. So on a new line, let's say for, and then open up a pair of parentheses. We will write a bit of code within these parentheses in just a moment, but for now let's leave it blank. And then let's add a pair of curly brackets, and in between the brackets, let's drop down to a new line to stay organized. Now, we know that we can access an element in our collection by saying list items, and then if we wanted the first item, we would say brackets 0. If we wanted the second item, we would say 1. If we wanted the third item, we would say 2. So wouldn't it be nice if instead of hard coding a number here, we could just include a dynamic variable that gets incremented by 1 each time the loop repeats itself? So check this out. Once we select a hypothetical element in our collection, then let's just say that we want to adjust its inner HTML to say hello world. So now all we would need our for loop to do is have I equals 0 at first and execute this code, and then increment the I variable to be 1 and then run through the code again, and then increment the I variable to be 2 and then 3 and then 4. You get the idea. Well, that's exactly what we do within the parentheses of the for loop. So let's begin by saying that our dynamic I variable should start out as 0 and then add a semicolon, and now we want to tell our for loop how long it should run, or in other words, how many times should it repeat itself. So we could just say we want it to run as long as our I variable is less than 5, because we know that there are 5 elements in our collection. But what if down the road there was 6 or 7 or 8 or 9? So instead of hard coding this number value here, instead we can have JavaScript count how many items are in this collection. So we can just say that the for loop should keep repeating as long as I is less than list items dot length. Let's add a semicolon, and then remember how we said that we want this I to increment by 1 each time the for loop repeats? So first it would be 0 and then 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, towards the end of our parentheses here, we just say I plus plus, which will increment the I variable by 1 each time the loop runs. So let's go ahead and save this and refresh in the browser. And we see that our for loop worked perfectly. This is great, but remember that this was just an example. We didn't actually want to change the text to hello world. What we really wanted to do was have each item be on the lookout for being clicked on. So let's make that happen now. back in our text editor. So we don't want to edit the HTML for each item in our collection. So this code will select each element in our collection. And to tell the element to be on the lookout for incoming clicks, we can use a method named addEventListener. Now within these parentheses, this method takes two arguments. The first argument is the name of the event that we're looking for. So in this case, that is click. And the second argument is what we want to happen once the element is clicked on. So we just type out the name of a function that we want to run in response to the click. Let's call a function named activateItem. All right, now I just made this function name up. As of now, this function doesn't exist, so now let's create it. So down on a new line, if we want to create our own new custom function, we begin the line by saying function, and then the name of the function we want to create. So activateItem, pair of parentheses, and then a pair of curly quotes. And anything within these curly quotes is the body of the function. So it's what will actually happen when this function runs. So just as a test, let's simply alert out a pop-up message that says click detected. So let's check this out in the browser. So when I click on one of these items, here is the click detected pop-up. And I can click on another one, so I'll click on the last item. And once again, it's working as expected. Okay, so now we're successfully detecting clicks on these list items. Now let's remember what we actually want to do when they are clicked on. So we want to update this headline text with the text from the list item that just got clicked on. So let's jump over to our JavaScript and make that happen. So up at the very top of our file, let's create a variable that selects the headline element. So let's say var our headline. We could have named the variable anything that we'd like, but then we just select the element. So let's say document get element by ID. And if I jump over to my HTML, remember that that element had an ID of our headline. All right, so with this variable in place, now let's work on the body of this function. So when a list item gets clicked, we don't want to alert a pop-up message. Instead, we want to do something to the our headline element. And what we want to do is adjust its inner HTML. So let's set it to equal the inner HTML of the list item that just got clicked on. Now JavaScript makes our lives very easy here, because JavaScript has a keyword named this, and JavaScript automatically populates the this keyword with a reference that points towards the specific element that got clicked on. And then we just want to find its inner HTML property. All right, let's save this and test it out in the browser. So if I click on the second item, perfect. And if I click on any of the others, it works just as expected. Excellent. Now next, let's set up this button so that when we click on it, it actually adds a new item to our list. So to make that happen, back in our JavaScript, let's begin by creating a variable up at the top that selects that button element. So var, let's name the variable our button. And before we actually select the element, why don't we jump into our HTML and give that button element a unique ID so we can select it. Our button. Okay, so this is the ID that we're looking for. So back in our JavaScript, we can just say document get element by ID our button. All right, so with this variable in place, now down on a new line, we can begin with our button and tell it to be on the lookout for any incoming clicks. So we know that we can use the method named addEventListener, and it takes two arguments. Remember, the first is the event that we're looking for or listening for. So in this case, that's a click event. And then the second argument is the name of the function that we want to run in response. So in just a second here, we'll create a new function. Let's name it create new item. All right, and now let's drop down to a new line and actually create this function. So function create new item. And what do we want this function to actually do? Well, we just want to add new HTML to this unordered list. So if we want to manipulate this unordered list, we should probably create a variable that selects it. So before we write this function, let's go back up to the top of this file and let's create a variable and name it our list. And if we jump to our HTML, we will remember that we gave our unordered list an ID of our list. So let's just select that. So document get element by ID, our list. All right, so with this in place, now let's actually build out the function that runs when we click on the button. So we want to begin with the our list element, and we want to manipulate its inner HTML property. Now, we don't just want to set its HTML to equal something new, because that would erase or wipe out all of the existing list items. So instead of resetting this inner HTML property with an equal sign, we can append something new to it. We can add on to the end of it by saying plus equal sign. So let's save this and test it out in the browser. So when I click on the button, we see something new, and we can click on it again and again and again. Let's go back to our JavaScript and fine-tune things a bit. So we want to make sure that this text we're adding is wrapped in a list item tag. So that looks a little bit better. And just for fun, why don't we have it increment and say something new 1, something new 2, something new 3. So to do that, back in our JavaScript, up at the top, why don't we create a variable and name it new item counter and just set it to equal 1. And then down within our function that creates each new list item, after we output the opening list item tag and something new, let's add a closing quote. And then in JavaScript, we can concatenate additional content to this string by using the plus symbol. And then let's just output our new item counter variable. And then we want to add on our closing list item. So another plus symbol, opening quotes. And then once this line of code completes, we can simply increment our new item counter variable by 1. So we can just say new item counter plus plus. So let's save this and test it out. Something new 1, something new 2, something new 3. It looks like we're missing a space in between new and the number. So let's just add a space here. Perfect. All right, and finally, let's make it so when we click on a list item, it becomes highlighted with the yellow or beige background color we saw in the demo. So back in our JavaScript, remember, this is the function that runs when a list item gets clicked on. So after this line of code, let's drop down to a new line. And remember, we can access the element that just got clicked on by using the this keyword. And if we want to give this element a beige background, let's just give it a CSS class that adjusts the background color. So we start with this element, and then we can use a method named classList. And then we want to add a class, so we say .add. I already have a CSS class named active that includes a beige background declaration. So let's save this and test it out. Perfect. But you'll notice that if I click on other items, now they're all beige. So we want it so that when you click on one item, it becomes the only highlighted or active item. So back in our JavaScript, before we add the class of active to the element that just got clicked on, we should first remove the class of active from all of its sibling elements. Now, we already have a variable that is a collection of all of the list item elements. So if we want to do something to each element in that collection, if we want to remove the class of active from them, we can use a for loop. Now, we've already written a for loop that iterates over the list items collection. So let's just copy and paste this for loop. And then let's paste our clipboard on this new line. Only in this case, instead of adding an event listener, we just want to remove a CSS class from each element. So we start with the element, and then we will adjust its class list. And we want to remove a class named active. So let's save this and test it out in the browser. Perfect. So now only the item that I just clicked has the beige highlight. Let's change gears a bit now. So I purposely saved a problem for our final topic in this video. So notice if I use this button to add a new item and then click on that new item, nothing happens. This is because the new item that I'm clicking didn't exist when the page first loaded and we initially created our variable that's a collection of all of the list items. So in other words, the new items that are dynamically generated by JavaScript, they didn't exist when we created this variable, this collection of list item elements. And so that means they never had any event listeners assigned to them. They don't know to be on the lookout for incoming clicks. Now, this act of event handling for hypothetical elements that might exist in the future is commonly referred to as event delegation. There are many different ways to handle this situation, but let me show you how I would do things. So instead of looping through our list items collection and adding an event listener for each and every item, let's actually go ahead and delete this for loop, and instead let's just add one single event listener for the parent unordered list element. So we already saved a selection to that element in our list variable. So we have that. Now let's add on an event listener. So add event listener. We want to be on the lookout for any click events. And when a click is detected, we want to fire the activate item function. So now clicking anywhere within the entire unordered list element will trigger this function, but we only want this code to run if we actually clicked on a list item element. So what we can do is wrap this code that I have highlighted within an if statement. The easiest way to do that would probably be to just cut and paste this content to our clipboard. So let's cut it. And let's create an if statement. We will write a bit of code within these parentheses in just a few seconds, but after the parentheses, we'll open up a pair of curly brackets, drop down to a new line between the brackets, and now we can paste back in our clipboard. All right, now within these parentheses, we're going to say that only if the actual specific element that was clicked on was a list item element, only if that is the case do we want any of the code within these brackets to run. Now, our event listener passes along all sorts of information about the click event that just happened, and all we need to do to access that information within our function is just add a parameter within our function's parentheses. We can name the parameter anything we'd like. I'll just call it E. And now within our if statement, we can say only if the target of the event that just occurred, and the target is the specific element that got clicked on, so only if that had an element type or a node name of list item do we want any of this code to fire. And we will also want to update this highlighted code a bit because the this keyword in this context will point towards the element that we assigned the event listener to, which is now our parent unordered list. So on this line right here, if we want to refer to the actual element that got clicked on, instead of the this keyword, we can use e.target. And we'll want to do the same thing on this line. So instead of this, we'll say e.target. And finally, this bit of code that removes the active class from all sibling elements, we'll want to update it a bit because we don't want to rely on our list items variable because the collection of elements in this variable becomes outdated as soon as we use our button to add new elements to the page. So we can just swap out list items here with a reference to the element that got clicked on, so e.target. And then we want to select that element's parent element, the unordered list, so dot parent node. And then we want to select all children of that element because that will give us all of the list item elements. And then again on our next line of code, we want to replace this reference to the list items variable. So to avoid extra typing, let's just copy and paste this selector that will give us all sibling list item elements. So copy that to my clipboard and then delete list items and then just paste in my clipboard. All right, now let's save this and test it out in the browser. So things are working as expected. And if we add several new items and then click on them, things are still working as expected. Perfect. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. But before I go, I want to share a really quick tip for selecting elements in JavaScript. So if your website's audience primarily uses modern web browsers, instead of using these cumbersome get element by ID and get elements by tag name, Modern browsers offer methods named query selector and query selector all. So for example, if we wanted to select the element that has an ID of our list, instead we could say document.querySelector, and this method allows for selectors that look like simple CSS or jQuery selectors. So we can just add a pound sign to indicate that we're looking for an ID, and that's it. If you were looking for a class, you would use a period instead of the pound sign. So query selector lets us select a single element. What if we want to select multiple elements or collection of elements? Well, we ended up not using our list items variable, but let's just try this as an example. So instead of first selecting the element by ID and then narrowing it down by tag name, that's a bit verbose and cumbersome. Instead, you could just say document query selector all, include a pound sign to look for an ID, say our list, and then you can create a descendant selector by just adding a space just like in CSS, and then find any list item elements. Anyways, that's just a quick tip at the end here about query selector and query selector all. If your audience primarily uses modern web browsers, I would go ahead and start using these today. All right, that's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next JavaScript video, we'll learn about object-oriented JavaScript. We'll learn more about what an object really is, how to create our own objects and blueprints for objects, and we'll learn why object-oriented programming is so useful in the first place. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you feel like you learned something, and I'll see you in a new video next Tuesday. If you haven't already, be sure to check out my brand new Get a Web Developer Job, Mastering the Modern Workflow course. As always, there's a link to it in the description.